In the quiet aftermath of World War II, when the world was still measuring the weight of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the United States faced a new kind of uncertainty. Not from an enemy across the ocean, but from the knowledge it now possessed. The bomb had ended one war, but its shadow was already casting the outline of the next. On the surface, global recovery had begun, but behind the headlines of rebuilding and peace, America's military machine was retooling for a different kind of battle. One fought in laboratories, test ranges, and the endless skies of the Pacific. The name for the next chapter, Operation Greenhouse. By 1947, the Cold War had begun to crystallize. The Soviet Union had seized Berlin's east and was rapidly consolidating power across Eastern Europe. Intelligence suggested that Moscow's scientists were racing toward their own atomic weapon. In response, Washington pushed for a program that would not only maintain nuclear superiority, but expand it. The newly formed Atomic Energy Commission, or AEC, was tasked with the impossible: to design, test, and perfect a new generation of weapons. Lighter, more efficient, and exponentially more powerful. Eniwetok Atoll, a remote chain of coral islands in the Marshall Archipelago, was chosen as the stage for this secret endeavor. It was isolated, uninhabited after forced evacuations, and far enough from public scrutiny to conceal almost anything. From the air, Eniwetok looked like paradise. But by 1950, its beaches were filled not with tourists, but with engineers, soldiers, and scientists, nearly 10,000 men under orders to construct a proving ground for the future of warfare. For many of the men arriving from San Francisco or Pearl Harbor, the voyage took weeks. They were greeted by barbed wire, makeshift barracks, and the distant rumble of bulldozers flattening coral reefs into runways. The 509th Bomb Wing, famous for delivering the Hiroshima bomb, returned under new leadership, now joined by the 4925th Test Group, an elite detachment of airmen trained for high-altitude observation and data collection. Officially, they were here to record atmospheric phenomena. Unofficially, they were preparing for detonations that no one outside the Pacific would ever witness. A diary entry from Captain Robert Connors, dated January 12, 1951, gives a glimpse of life on the atoll. "We're told this will change the world again, but no one says how. The heat, the salt, the waiting. It's like sitting inside a ticking clock, and we're not sure who wound it." Connors' unease was shared by many. The scientists from Los Alamos and the University of California worked in silence, designing test towers and instrumentation bunkers under the direction of Dr. Norris Bradbury, the successor to J. Robert Oppenheimer. Yet even within this tight circle, information was compartmentalized. Each team knew only what they needed to complete. Each flight order bore a different designation. And yet, the phrase greenhouse began to circulate among the men, a code whispered in the mess halls, referring to something beyond the official briefings. The secrecy was unprecedented. Every document was stamped with restricted data, and any unapproved note-taking was a court-martial offense. Mail was censored, photographs confiscated. Even naval convoys bringing supplies were misdirected under unrelated operation names. The press releases referred vaguely to defense testing in the Pacific, never naming Eniwetok or its purpose. When asked by Congress about the expenditure, the AEC offered vague assurances of continued atomic safety research, and yet, the operation's ambition was unmistakable. The objective wasn't simply to repeat Hiroshima, it was to design weapons that could bridge the gap toward fusion. A thermonuclear trigger, as the classified documents described, capable of unlocking an energy yield far beyond anything tested before. The scientists were stepping into territory that even they feared could go catastrophically wrong. Officers noted the construction of an additional observation tower not listed on the official diagrams, one placed on the northern edge of Alugalub Island. When asked about its purpose, project engineers simply called it a calibration site. But by the end of January, it was heavily guarded, and even senior personnel lacked clearance to approach it. One memo from the 4925th Commander, Lieutenant Colonel Samuel O'Neill, mentioned aircraft designation anomalies, planes dispatched for reconnaissance that never filed return logs. Two of them, both modified B-17s, reportedly failed to report from Sector 9 and were marked as mechanical losses, yet their flight paths suggested something else, a mission perimeter extending far beyond the atoll toward unmarked coordinates in the Pacific. By March 1951, the test site was complete. Towers loomed over the water like skeletal giants, surrounded by miles of instrument cables and camera stations. Thousands of feet of film would capture each flash, every cloud formation, and the shock waves as they rippled across the lagoon. The operation's first detonation, codenamed Dog, was only weeks away. But beneath the technical precision, tension simmered. The men stationed there didn't yet know the full scope of what they were building, or what would be lost when the countdown began. As one engineer later recalled, "We thought we were testing the limits of science. What we didn't know was how much they weren't telling us." The Pacific wind carried the sound of generators through the night. Somewhere beyond the reef, ships waited silently in formation. Operation Greenhouse was ready to begin, but the records would never tell the full story of what was about to happen. In the first months of 1951, the isolated atoll of Enewetak was transformed into one of the most secretive places on Earth. From the air, it appeared as little more than a speck in the vast Pacific. But to those who lived behind its fences, it was a labyrinth of cables, bunkers, and coded orders. Every dawn brought new drills, new measurements, and a growing sense that something far larger was at stake than the men had been told. Operation Greenhouse was no longer an experiment. It was a race against time, against the Soviets, and perhaps against their own understanding of what they were unleashing. The scientists from Los Alamos and the University of Chicago worked side by side under floodlights that turned the coral sands silver. They designed precision triggers, thin-layered plutonium cores, and advanced implosion mechanisms, all under the watch of military security officers who patrolled day and night. The command structure was absolute. Civilian engineers received orders from the U.S. Air Force's 49th and 25th Test Group, while logistics and security were managed by the Navy's Task Force 3.5. Every name, every number, every aircraft was recorded, or at least, it should have been. Officially, Operation Greenhouse was to consist of 4 tests. Dog, Easy, George, and Item. Each was intended to push the limits of nuclear design, to explore new fuels, new configurations, and new delivery systems. But among the crews, there was a quiet rumor of a 5th test, one not listed on any manifest. Some called it Project Echo, others whispered Greenhouse Shadow. It was said to involve a prototype core flown in by a C-124 Globemaster from Kirtland Air Force Base, escorted by armed MPs who refused to speak to anyone. The base commander, Brigadier General John E. Upston, recorded in his log on March 14th. Received shipment from Kirtland. Weight 1.2 tons. No manifest. AC oversight. Restricted clearance. Crew not briefed. The entry was later redacted in the official AEC archive. Meanwhile, flights from the 4925th were being lost in paperwork. A B-29 Superfortress designated Fever Pitch, carrying atmospheric sensors, reportedly went off course and failed to report its final altitude data. Another aircraft, a converted B-17 nicknamed June Angel, returned without half its film reels. The crew insisted they had followed orders, but their recorded flight path extended nearly 300 miles beyond the assigned testing perimeter, toward a patch of ocean with no recorded coordinates. The data from both missions was later marked classified, do not process. In letters never meant for publication, technicians described strange discrepancies in the readings they did manage to recover. Pressure waves inconsistent with expected detonation patterns. Light spectra suggesting yields far higher than what the bombs were supposed to produce. Yet when the data was relayed to the mainland, analysts at Los Alamos received only fragments, missing pages, altered numbers, and reports that arrived rewritten in another hand. Private Walter Monroe, a communications operator, later testified in a 1973 interview. "We were told not to log any signals coming from Grid 7. That was the rule. Don't ask, don't listen, don't write it down. But I remember one night the radio lit up and we heard it. 2 short bursts, then static. They said it was interference, but interference doesn't repeat in Morse." The static transmissions, recorded only briefly before being cut off, were never officially acknowledged. By late March, as the first test drew near, morale began to waver. The heat was oppressive, the secrecy exhausting. Engineers lived in improvised huts barely 200 yards from contaminated zones. Every man knew he was part of something historic, but few understood how dangerous it truly was. Radiation monitors began to malfunction. their readings fluctuating between 0 and lethal doses within seconds. Instrument drift, the officers called it, though several technicians quietly dismantled their meters and found nothing wrong with the equipment. At night, ships anchored offshore maintained blackout conditions. No lights, no signals. The men aboard were forbidden to speak of their mission. The USS Curtis, serving as the operation's floating laboratory, carried sealed cargo bays protected by armed guards. When docked, its decks were cleared. Even naval personnel were not told what was inside. The mystery deepened when Commander George J. Nichols, a Navy liaison assigned to the Curtis, filed a missing equipment report. One 16mm film canister, 2 still cameras, and 1 logbook not recovered following flight from Station Baker. Equipment last seen aboard support aircraft 7132A. None of the missing items were ever found. The plane itself landed safely. Despite the tension, preparations continued. Cables were buried, towers erected, and hundreds of test instruments calibrated to capture data at the millisecond scale. The countdowns were rehearsed repeatedly. On April 7th, General Upston issued the official order. Operation Greenhouse would proceed. But among the ground crews, unease turned to dread. Some men claimed they had seen unmarked aircraft circling at high altitude during the final readiness test. Planes with no insignia, no radio contact, and no acknowledgement in the daily logs. The Air Force denied their existence. Yet when the films from the observation stations were reviewed, frames were missing, precise intervals cut from every reel. In the official record, this period is summarized in 2 words: operational secrecy. But those who were there remember the silence differently, not as security, but as something deliberately erased. Operation Greenhouse was now in motion. The first detonation, Dog, would soon light the Pacific sky. But beneath the blinding flash, the questions had already begun. What was being tested, and what were they trying so hard to hide? April 8th, 1951. Dawn rose over Eniwetok Atoll, pale and still, the lagoon like a mirror, reflecting a sky too calm for what was about to happen. After years of secret preparation, Operation Greenhouse was ready for its first detonation. Its codename, Dog. The men had rehearsed every motion, memorized every number, and now they waited for the order that would unleash the most powerful weapon the world had yet seen. At least, officially, the Dog test was a straightforward fission bomb, designed to measure the efficiency of new core geometries and improved lens systems. But to the scientists in the observation bunkers, this was only a prelude, a test of logistics, not physics. The real experiment, the one no one spoke of directly, was still weeks away. For now, they called it calibration. At exactly 06:35 hours, the countdown began. Voices echoed through the command posts. 10 seconds. Then the horizon flared white. A fireball lifted from the tower on Island Amen, consuming the sky. Men behind leaded glass felt the heat even through protective walls. The lagoon erupted with concentric ripples that broke against the shore, and the wind that followed carried a sound like tearing metal. The Dog shot yielded about 81 kilotons, 6 times the Hiroshima bomb. The data came in clean, the instruments held, and the military declared the test a success. But within hours, engineers noted inconsistencies. Atmospheric readings spiked higher than expected, and one of the offshore detectors, a weather balloon rigged with sensors, recorded an extra pulse of gamma radiation seconds after detonation. Reflected wave anomaly, the report read. No one could explain why the timing didn't match. Over the next few weeks, 3 more tests followed: Easy, George, and Item. Each was deadlier, more complex, and more secretive than the last. Easy validated a lighter core design. Item confirmed that neutron injection could trigger near-instant chain reactions, but it was George that changed everything. George was the first test to successfully demonstrate a thermonuclear reaction, the first to use fusion as part of a bomb's design. The weapon, mounted on a 200-foot tower, was not meant for combat. It was a prototype, a scientific proof. The goal was to determine if the heat from a fission explosion could ignite a secondary hydrogen isotope. It was a theory born from the Super program, the brainchild of physicist Edward Teller. When the bomb was detonated on May 8, 1951, observers reported that the entire sky turned to glass. The yield was officially measured at 225 kilotons, but internal memos suggested far more. Radiation patterns stretched beyond predicted boundaries, reaching the far edges of the atoll. Cameras positioned in reinforced bunkers captured footage that would later vanish from AEC archives. One technician, Private First Class Harold Jensen, later described what he saw that morning. It was like watching the sun come up inside the water. The air went white, then black, then white again. And then it rained. Not water, something finer like dust. But it burned when it touched your skin. Jensen's testimony was dismissed as radiation rash. Yet, within months, 3 of his fellow technicians were hospitalized for severe beta burns that didn't match known exposure patterns. Among the scientists, the results were both triumphant and troubling. The data from George confirmed fusion ignition, the first step toward the hydrogen bomb. But something else appeared in the records, a secondary thermal spike not consistent with the device's design. The AEC labeled it an instrumentation error. But in an internal telegram from Los Alamos to Washington, Dr. Norris Bradbury wrote, "Recommend immediate suppression of spectral data from shot G. Correlation impossible with known yields." Meanwhile, across the Pacific, British intelligence had begun to take notice. Station 15B, an MI6 listening post in Singapore, intercepted fragments of American radio traffic describing unregistered detonations and deviation from expected signatures. The messages were heavily encoded, but one phrase appeared more than once: Greenhouse 5. London analysts speculated that it referred to an undisclosed secondary test, possibly conducted under cover of George's fallout. Back on Eniwetok, several airmen from the 49 25th Test Group were assigned to film aerial footage of George from high altitude. Their mission logs show a planned flight time of 0630 to 0730 hours, but the reels returned missing entire sequences, the few remaining frames showing only streaks of light and an indistinct plume stretching vertically far beyond the known detonation altitude. The AEC's film division labeled the material unusable and ordered it destroyed, but not before a copy reportedly made its way into private storage at Kirtland Air Force Base. Then, without warning, the schedule changed. Item, the final test, was moved up by nearly a week. The official reason, weather conditions. Unofficially, some believed it was meant to divert attention from whatever anomaly had occurred during George. When Item was detonated, it behaved as expected. No irregularities, no missing footage. Yet, several of the scientists who had worked on George were quietly reassigned or sent back to the mainland within days. Their replacements were instructed not to ask questions. By the end of May 1951, the operation was declared complete, but the rumors didn't fade. Some men swore they'd seen a 5th tower rise briefly in the northern sector, dismantled before any official inspection. Others spoke of unmarked crates loaded aboard the USS Curtis under guard at night, bound for destinations unknown. In public reports, Operation Greenhouse was hailed as a milestone in nuclear progress, the first proof that fusion could be harnessed. But buried in the classified addendum was a single sentence that hinted at what might have been hidden. Not all detonations recorded match-known configurations. For decades, those words would remain the only trace of what many would later call the missing blast. And as Eniwetok returned to silence, the Pacific still held its secret, buried beneath the waves, waiting for the next storm to stir it again. By the summer of 1951, the Pacific was calm again. The towers at Eniwetok had been dismantled, the ships dispersed and the personnel rotated, back to bases across the United States and the Pacific. Fleet. Official communiques celebrated Operation Greenhouse as a scientific triumph, the bridge between atomic fission and the coming age of hydrogen fusion. Newspapers ran headlines like "America leads the atomic frontier." Yet within classified corridors in Washington and London, the tone was markedly different. There were questions, too many and too quiet, about what had really taken place on those remote coral islands. In London's Vauxhall Cross, home of the Secret Intelligence Service, coded cables began arriving from Singapore, Port Darwin, and Pearl Harbor. They referred to irregular radiation traces, unexplained aerial phenomena, and telemetry gaps from American Pacific tests. The British had been observers during Greenhouse, invited as token allies in the new nuclear partnership. Yet MI6 agents soon suspected that they hadn't been shown everything. One such agent, Captain Edwin Halstead, reported from the British Liaison Office at Eniwetok that entire test records were being withheld. His confidential memo, dated June 2, 1951, read, AEC officers continue to redact atmospheric data beyond 180 microseconds post-detonation. Local technicians whisper of greenhouse shadow, an unregistered device tested offshore from Lab. American personnel tense and evasive. Recommend discreet verification of film logs and spectral records. When the report reached Whitehall, it was quietly buried under joint cooperation protocols. The Cold War alliance was too fragile to risk with accusations. Yet, within the British Atomic Energy Authority, some physicists couldn't ignore the discrepancies. If the Americans had tested a fifth device, one that advanced beyond the declared fusion prototype, it would change everything about the emerging balance of power. At the same time, the CIA's newly formed Office of Scientific Intelligence, OSI, compiled internal summaries of British concerns. An excerpt, now declassified, reads, "UK observers suspect non-declared detonation within greenhouse series. No corroboration. Possible misinterpretation of meteorological interference or optical illusions. Recommend maintaining deniability." Still, inconsistencies in the data persisted. The spectroscopic reports from the George shot displayed peaks indicating deuterium fusion, expected, but also unaccounted for traces of lithium-6 activation. That isotope wasn't part of any known device configuration, yet it would later become a key component of the first true hydrogen bomb, Ivy Mike, detonated only a year later on the same atoll. Among the scientists at Los Alamos, whispers circulated of the premature test, a small-scale thermonuclear reaction attempted before official authorization. It was either a failure or something they couldn't explain, recalled one researcher decades later, but they erased it before the paperwork caught up. Meanwhile, British intelligence gathered its own fragments. In August 1951, an MI6 cable decrypted by the Government Communications Headquarters, GCHQ, included this line from a US Navy transmission intercepted near Johnston Island. Additional sequence completed, under 100 kilotons. Classification withheld per Directive Greenhouse 5. Data secured by AEC Courier. No such directive was ever found in American archives. As autumn approached, the trans-Pacific correspondence between Washington and London grew tense. Sir William Penny, Britain's leading atomic scientist and architect of the UK's own bomb programme, had personally attended the George detonation. Upon returning, he noted that some of the American recording instruments had been removed before the test, replaced by devices with unfamiliar calibration markings. They were not Los Alamos models, Penny later said. They looked experimental, possibly prototypes from Sandia or an unnamed contractor. The British were right to be wary. Internal AEC minutes from June 1951, released decades later under the Freedom of Information Act, reveal that certain test artifacts from Eniwetok were transported to Sandia, base under armed escort, bypassing the standard chain of custody. These crates, labelled non-fission experimental assemblies, were never logged in Sandia's receiving records. Still, for the American public, the story remained one of triumph. Films of George were shown to select congressional committees, carefully edited and scored with patriotic narration. But even those reels ended abruptly before the full duration of the blast. In one surviving letter, an AEC cinematographer confessed, "We were told to destroy every frame beyond 15 seconds. That's when the light changed and the colors went wrong." Across the Atlantic, MI6 analysts debated whether the Americans had tested a new isotope blend or something altogether more dangerous, a device capable of releasing energy without a complete chain reaction, a hybrid between fission and fusion. Theories ranged from design error to deliberate concealment. The phrase greenhouse shadow became internal shorthand for any unexplained American nuclear data. Then, in late September 1951, the trail went cold. Communications from US Pacific Command to Allied observers stopped referencing the greenhouse series entirely. The files were sealed, and British access to American nuclear data was quietly downgraded. Even Sir William Penny was told that cooperation would resume only post-Ivy. For the men who had stood on the coral sand and watched the horizon burn, the silence was maddening. "We saw 5 flashes," one sailor would later insist in an oral history. "They told us there were 4, but no evidence of a 5th tower, a 5th bomb, or a 5th report has ever been verified. Only the scattered traces remained. Odd radiation readings, missing film reels, and a string of redacted memos connecting Eniwetok to Sandia and beyond. As the classified doors closed, a quiet realization settled among those who'd seen too much. History would remember only what the documents allowed. And in those documents, Operation Greenhouse was complete. 4 tests. 1 success, no anomalies. Yet across the Pacific, British intelligence continued to mark a single word in their cables for years to come. Shadow. Whatever had happened in that unrecorded blast, it had vanished into the deepest vaults of the atomic age, leaving only questions, and the faint echo of a 5th detonation that never officially existed. By 1952, Eniwetok Atoll had already become a scar on the map of the Pacific. The coral islands that once glowed under the tropical sun now shimmered with something invisible, a contamination that no tide could wash away. The official records stated that Operation Greenhouse had ended the previous May, yet convoys still arrived under the cover of darkness, bringing survey teams, scientists, and crates marked "Restricted, return to AEC." The men who came ashore were told they were studying residual radiation, but the truth as it slowly emerged was far more complicated. The new arrivals belonged to a composite unit drawn from the Air Force Special Weapons Command and the AEC's Radiological Safety Section, RADSAFE. Their mission was, ostensibly, to measure environmental impact and determine the atoll's suitability for future testing. But when they unpacked their Geiger counters and dosimeters, something immediately stood out. The readings made no sense. Levels of residual radiation were inconsistent, with some zones showing far higher intensity than expected, particularly around Elugelab Island, the primary site of the George detonation. Captain Leonard Swain, the officer in charge of the survey team, noted in his daily log, Sector 9 shows radiation signatures distinct from fission residues, higher energy particles, possibly neutron activation products, consistent pattern of lithium presence in soil samples, no record of lithium deployment during Operation Greenhouse. That single note, quietly written in pencil, would later be blacked out in the archived report. Swain's men found more than just strange readings. Beneath a layer of scorched coral near the northern shoreline, they uncovered fragments of alloyed metal, not from tower supports or aircraft wreckage, but machined components that appeared melted and fused. "Not any steel we've used," one metallurgist said, shaking his head. The fragments were collected, boxed, and flown to Los Alamos under armed guard. They were never seen again. Local Marshallese workers who had been forcibly displaced to nearby Ujalang Atoll began to whisper stories about glowing debris and disappearing survey teams. "The Americans go to the island," one said, "and the next day, no boat returns." Officially, there were no casualties. Unofficially, at least 2 technicians from Sandia Laboratories went missing during that summer's survey. Their names, David L. Parker and John R. Witt, appeared briefly in a military personnel log before being erased. From the following month's roster, the secrecy surrounding Eniwetok deepened as the AEC prepared for the next major operation, Ivy Mike. That test, scheduled for November 1952, would dwarf everything that came before. But as equipment began to arrive for Ivy, many of the same men who had served under Greenhouse noticed something eerily familiar. Certain crates, marked as archival instruments, carried the same serial numbers as those used in the supposed 5th test. "They were recycling the same gear," said one Air Force technician decades later. Only, nobody wanted to talk about where it came from. Meanwhile, health reports from veterans of Greenhouse started to trickle in. Strange illnesses, rashes, and chronic fatigue plagued men who had served less than 6 months on the atoll. The Navy labeled them as heat-related injuries, but internal medical memos referenced localized beta exposure inconsistent with expected dispersal patterns. In one confidential letter, a medical officer wrote, "Symptoms correspond more closely with contact to neutron-activated isotopes than with standard fallout exposure. Unknown source." Still, the military insisted the site was safe. Teams continued to survey Elugelab and its neighboring islands, occasionally finding sealed concrete bunkers that were not on any construction plans. Some were empty, others flooded. But one, near the island's northern ridge, was found welded shut. When engineers finally opened it, they discovered an array of decommissioned instruments still humming faintly, powered by corroded batteries. Among the debris was a metal crate labeled Mark Theed, Experimental Assembly. The markings matched those of devices rumoured to be part of a cancelled AEC project at Sandia. Swain ordered the bunker sealed again. His report was filed but never acknowledged. By late 1952, as preparations for Ivy Mike intensified, Eniwetak's earlier secrets were buried beneath layers of official protocol and military bureaucracy. When the Mike shot finally obliterated Elugalab Island, the world saw it as the dawn of the hydrogen age, a single, blinding moment of progress. But for those who had served under Greenhouse, it felt like the deliberate erasure of evidence. The missing reels, the strange readings, the unmarked crates, all of it vanished in a flash that turned an island into a crater. In later years, retired physicists who had worked on Greenhouse would recall details that didn't fit the official narrative. "They told us it was a calibration," said one Los Alamos engineer. But there was something under that tower, a smaller device, nested inside another. I think they were testing something they didn't want anyone else to see. Even decades later, radiation survey data from the Greenhouse sites remain inconsistent. The isotopic ratios in the soil of Elugalab don't match any of the 4 declared bomb types. Some readings suggest an additional energy source, possibly a neutron amplification system, a technology far ahead of what was publicly known in 1951. For historians, the unanswered questions about Operation Greenhouse linger like a shadow behind the blinding light of Ivy Mike. What exactly detonated in that lagoon? Was it a failed prototype, a premature fusion experiment, or something deliberately erased to maintain secrecy? When declassified fragments surfaced in the 1990s, one marginal note in an AEC document seemed to summarize the dilemma best. Eniwetak data redacted to prevent misinterpretation of early thermonuclear phenomena. Further inquiry not advised. The Pacific breeze still whispers over the lagoon today, carrying silence where once stood towers and bunkers and secrets. For those who were there, one question has never faded. Did Operation Greenhouse truly end in May 1951? Or was its most important test buried forever beneath the ashes of Elugalab? For decades, Operation Greenhouse remained buried under layers of bureaucracy, secrecy, and silence. The classified records sat untouched in the archives of the Atomic Energy Commission and the Department of Defense, their pages stamped "Restricted Data" and "Do Not Declassify." To the public, the Greenhouse series was a success story of scientific progress, a stepping stone to the hydrogen bomb. But for historians, veterans, and a handful of scientists who couldn't forget what they'd seen, the story didn't add up. Too many gaps, too many missing pages, too many voices that were silenced. When the Freedom of Information Act began to pry open the vaults in the late 1970s, fragments of Operation Greenhouse resurfaced. Reports were heavily redacted. Entire paragraphs struck out, names removed, and photographs blanked with white paint. Yet the fragments that survived painted a different picture of what had happened on Eniwetak. Test footage labelled Dog and George appeared out of sequence. Calibration data referenced Shot 5 with no associated entry. A single memo from the AEC's Los Alamos Field Division read, "Data from auxiliary detonation to be sealed under Greenhouse Security Annex. Further dissemination unauthorized." But there was no annex listed in any official index. By 1983, a congressional subcommittee investigating radiation exposure among Pacific veterans began probing Operation Greenhouse's inconsistencies. Testimonies from Air Force and Navy personnel revealed that several had participated in unlisted missions, reconnaissance flights, and nighttime transport runs that didn't match the 4 known test dates. One pilot, Major Robert Haynes, swore under oath that he had filmed a 5th explosion from 20,000 feet, a smaller detonation just north of Elugalab. When questioned about the film, he replied that it was confiscated upon landing. The Air Force later declared his recollection inaccurate due to atmospheric glare. Then came the declassified medical files. Dozens of servicemen who had participated in Greenhouse reported early-onset cancers, cataracts, and thyroid disorders, illnesses consistent with neutron exposure, not standard fallout. Yet, none of the official test yields supported such dosage levels. One Navy doctor's handwritten note, found among 1952 health reports, stated, "Exposure data inconsistent with declared yields. Possible fifth source unaccounted for." The deeper investigators looked, the more they encountered a pattern of disappearance. Aerial photos missing frames, laboratory notebooks missing pages, entire crates of test film logged out from Sandia Base and never logged back in. A 1953 memorandum from the Joint Committee on Atomic Energy cryptically mentioned select greenhouse materials transferred to Project 127C. No record of 127C has ever been found. Meanwhile, Cold War historians in both the United States and Britain began comparing notes. MI6's long-sealed shadow files, released in fragments in the early 1990s, referenced Greenhouse 5 as an unacknowledged American prototype employing staged fusion. According to those British cables, the United States had achieved partial thermonuclear ignition a full year before publicly admitting the technology's success with Ivy Mike. If true, it meant that the world's first hydrogen reaction had not occurred in November 1952, but quietly in May 1951 under the Pacific stars. Not everyone believed it. Some claimed the anomalies were nothing more than data noise, misreadings, or bureaucratic confusion. But others pointed to the sheer precision of what was missing. Not random pages, but specific data, neutron flux, film exposure rates, and isotopic readings from Sector 9, the same area where Captain Swain's team had recorded inexplicable radiation spikes. In 2007, when another batch of AEC files was declassified, a memo surfaced from 1954 addressed to the Director of Military Applications. Recommend indefinite withholding of greenhouse annex materials. Public release could lead to misinterpretation of early thermonuclear principles. Evidence does not align with official chronology. Even today, historians can't agree on what that memo meant. But one thing is clear: the US government intentionally rewrote the timeline of its early nuclear development. Whether to conceal, premature success, technical failure, or geopolitical strategy remains unknown. Satellite imagery from the modern era shows faint disturbances beneath the lagoon, near where Elugelab once stood, possible remnants of structures or instrumentation buried under layers of coral. Divers have reported metallic debris scattered across the ocean floor, fused together as if melted by intense heat. None of these findings appear in any official environmental report. For the Marshallese people, whose ancestral lands became the proving ground for these experiments, the consequences have lasted generations. Radiation levels on some islands remain dangerously high. Graves were relocated, coral reefs destroyed, and entire communities displaced. Yet even their testimonies mention strange nights, unrecorded detonations, lights in the sky, and flashes that came from nowhere. As one island elder recalled in a 1998 documentary, "We counted 5, not 4. One was small, but the sea glowed like fire." Today, Operation Greenhouse stands as both a scientific milestone and a historical enigma, a crossroads between the known and the concealed. The 4 official tests are celebrated in textbooks, but the rumors of a 5th linger in the background, whispered among archivists and veterans who still search for the missing reels. In the end, what remains is not just a mystery of technology, but of intention. Did the United States conduct an unacknowledged nuclear experiment to leap ahead of the Soviets? Or did something occur at Eniwetok that defied explanation, a result they could neither replicate nor control? The documents end where the questions begin. Somewhere beneath the calm waters of Eniwetok, under coral and ash, the answers may still be waiting, silent, sealed, and radioactive in the heart of the Pacific's most secret test.